Yes, my name is Laura Draucker. I work for the World Resources Institute based in Washington, D.C. And before I get started, I just want to say thank you on behalf of myself, Andrea, and the rest of our colleagues to everyone who's participated in our process, and particularly the road testing companies. The feedback we received from them really exceeded our expectations. I mean, we learned so much from that process, and as you saw from the last three presentations, they also learned something too, so I think it was really a win-win situation. In addition to written feedback they provided us, we had 3 days of in-person workshops at WRI, 1.5 days for each standard, and we had about 40 of the 60 companies come and participate in those in-person workshops. And I believe the conversation there, it was wonderful. It was very frank. Everyone was very open to discuss both the benefits and issues of the standards, and I think, again, we all learned a lot. So taking that feedback, we compiled it all and went to our steering committee meeting, which was another 3-day meeting in Norway in the end of June. And that's where we came up with the proposed revisions to the standard. I'm going to give you a summary of those revisions now. I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't want to bore you, and I know I'm the last person before lunch. So, but I hope I can get you excited to download the next draft of the document and provide written comments when we open that comment period, hopefully next week. So some of the summary of the revisions to the product standard. We clarified the role of comparisons, revised the boundary requirements, added additional guidance on land use, uncertainty, recycling allocation, revisited the data definitions and provided a little more guidance there, streamlined the reporting requirements a little bit, added some guidance on calculating and reporting biogenic emissions. I'm going to touch on a few of these right now, sort of based on the conversations we've already had today. The first is how we handle product comparisons. We got a lot of feedback that it wasn't really clear what we were trying to do with the standard from the first draft. So what we want to say clearly now is that what this standard does is support product performance tracking over time by a company. This is something that has been proven successful in corporate accounting, where companies publicly report their inventory, come up with reductions targets, and then show those reductions to their stakeholders over time. This is something we think the standard can support as is. For anything more specific than that, where you want to make purchasing decisions, do a label, or make some claims about the performance of your product versus others, we do recognize that additional specification is needed in the form of perhaps sector guidance or product rules. And then finally, comparative assertions, as defined by ISO 14044, are not supported by our standard, mainly because we don't assess more than one environmental impact. But I think these last two things are somewhere where I think this community needs to go to figure out how to move forward in that space and make comparable product greenhouse gas inventories. On the boundary setting, we still have the same requirement that all attributable processes shall be included in the product inventory, and we provide guidance on what we mean by attributable. But one thing we did add, based on Stephanie's feedback and others, is the allowance for companies to justify exclusions and disclose those in the inventory report based on perhaps a de minimis or a cutoff criteria of their choosing. This is because we got a lot of feedback that in some products it's not in the best, it's not for the business, it's not the best to go and try to collect data for very, very, very small things. So we provide guidance on what's a justifiable exclusion, if there's a data gap, if it's known to have, if it's estimated to have not be environmentally significant. And any significant threshold that's applied, the company needs to justify and report in the inventory report for transparency. This has already come up quite a few times. So the original standard stated that capital goods shall be included if significant. And we provided a lot of guidance on how to determine significance. And what feedback we got on that is that it, first of all, is very difficult to determine if capital goods are significant, and of the companies that did attempt it, they all found capital goods to be fairly insignificant. So therefore, because we're providing a general standard, we have reduced this requirement to a recommendation. So non-attributable processes, such as capital goods, should be included when relevant. We provide guidance on relevance. This could be sector-specific relevance. This could be relevance to a business goal, but it's no longer a requirement to determine the significance of capital goods. Finally, our requirements around cradle-to-grave versus cradle-to-gate assessment. We haven't changed this a lot, but I do think, and while I still think we encourage cradle-to-grave assessments as much as possible, we do recognize that there are situations where either the function of the product and its final use is unknown, or it's just not in the business interest of the company to maybe do a cradle-to-grave inventory for their intermediate products, and therefore cradle-to-gate inventories are allowable. On data, we didn't make any changes to the data requirements. We didn't hear any complaints that primary data under the control of the reporting company should not be collected. So that's still a requirement. But we did hear a lot of feedback that we needed to clarify what we meant by primary data. So we've tried to do that by stating that it's specific to the given process. This doesn't mean it's necessarily from a supplier, but it has to be specific to the process that's being studied. And we remove the hierarchy between primary and secondary data. For all other processes, primary or secondary data shall be collected, but we have integrated the data quality assessment into the data collection. We got a lot of feedback that having that as the next chapter kind of encouraged companies to first collect data and then assess quality, which isn't the most effective way to do that. So we've moved a lot of the discussion around assessing data quality during the collection phase. And many of you have seen these criteria before, the same indicators that are usually seen for assessing data quality. And then we're also much more clear in this version of the standard what data needs to be assessed. Activity data, emission factors, and or direct emission measurements would be assessed using data quality. Another confusion with data was actually how to report on data. It wasn't very clear in the previous standard, so we've tried to clarify that. For significant processes, companies shall report a descriptive statement of the data sources, the data quality, and any efforts taken to improve data quality. The definition of significance here is, again, left up to the company. Different companies will have different levels of significance. We heard some examples today of what was significant to Procter & Gamble in their use and end-of-life phases. And this is just to allow companies to be able to explain to their stakeholders, how they feel about their data and where they think data improvements could be made. We also want to add a little more transparency to the type of data used to calculate an inventory. This way you couldn't take two inventory reports, one of which used all financial data and one that used all primary data, and make a comparison there. So we've included in the reporting template that companies shall report the percentage of total from primary data, secondary process data, and secondary financial data. Of course, if you don't know the data, there's also the opportunity to put it in the unspecified category. And finally, I think this might, at least personally, was one of the most surprising amount of feedback we got, is the amount of companies that really wanted some way to report on uncertainty. So we have added a requirement that companies shall report a qualitative statement on the sources of uncertainty and methodology choices. For those of you that are on our stakeholder list, you would have seen that earlier in the summer we sent out a request for proposals on a couple different guidance sections, one of which was uncertainty, and we worked with Qantas, a lifecycle consulting firm, to help us develop this guidance on both qualitative and quantitative uncertainty. Qualitative is included in the report, and then there's some more guidance on more quantitative uncertainty in the appendix, and they're actually even providing a calculation tool that's going to be available free on our website for people to help them calculate their uncertainty. Recycling. This wasn't mentioned today, but it was a hot topic of feedback both from stakeholders and road testers. And this was one area where road testers actually agreed that we could really provide some more specificity. So we worked very closely with the steering committee and the technical working group members and road testers to try to come up with some way to add more specificity to recycling. I can't do it justice right now, the details on it, but just to give you a sense so you can go to the standard and read it. We've provided choice between two methods, one which we call the 100-0 input method. Basically, the recycling material inputs are assigned 100% of the recycling process emissions, and the outputs are assigned 0%. This is typical to a type of cutoff recycling method. And then the other is the 0-100 output method, where the recycling material output is assigned 100% of the burdens, but then virgin material input can be displaced by the amount of recycled material with the same inherent properties, and this is analogous to the closed-loop approximation method. So we provide a lot additional guidance on how to use both these methods, when one may be appropriate over the other, and vice versa. But of course, because we're a general standard, we still allow companies to use other methods if they feel those are more justified for their product, and those just need to be disclosed and justified in the inventory report. And we hope this is a good first step to moving towards a little bit more specificity in how recycling is handled in product greenhouse gas inventories. Finally, for reporting, I've touched on a lot of the different reporting elements through my presentation, but a few things that are specific to reporting. First thing I want to clear up is that we no longer, it was never our intention to have a time frame for which the report needed to be redone, but this was confusing by the way the chapter was written. So we've removed any mention of the fact that companies need to redo this within a year, within 2 years. That's no longer that was never and is not a requirement in the standard. We got a lot of feedback that it wasn't quite clear how to report on biogenic emissions. In the corporate standard, the approach is to report biogenic combustion emissions separately. We've got feedback that adds confusion. It doesn't really represent the carbon cycle. So what we've decided to do, and I think this is also consistent with what ISO 67 is moving towards, is to report separately the biogenic and non-biogenic removals and emissions. Also, separate from that would be land use impacts when applicable, and all three of these, biogenic, non-biogenic, and land use impacts, would total to the total inventory results. Of course, companies that don't have materials with biogenic origins don't need to worry about this, but this is particularly for those companies that use biomass-based products. Finally, we had a lot of discussion about how to handle delayed emissions. We sort of weighed out all of the options on how to do this, and we came to the conclusion that we don't think there's no scientific consensus yet that delayed emissions are appropriate to include in a greenhouse gas accounting inventory. So what we've decided to do for the next draft is state that a weighting factor shall not be applied to the total inventory results, but companies wishing to report the results with a weighting factor may do so separately. And this is really to provide that transparency to stakeholders. Companies may find that including delayed emissions is important to their product and they want to do that, but we just require that they also report the results without the delayed emissions so stakeholders can see what impact that may have. And finally, this was already included, but I think we got feedback that this needed to be more prevalent, is a disclaimer on how stakeholders should use the results of the inventory report. We don't provide only a number. We feel very strongly that you need a report with not too much information, but enough information so that stakeholders can use the results correctly. To ensure that even more, we include a disclaimer saying, these results are not comparable to other products unless X, Y, and Z are the same. We obviously know that just the disclaimer cannot stop people from using the results incorrectly, but we hope that it will make people think twice, I guess, before doing that. Moving on quickly to Scope 3, we clarified the definitions of some of the categories in the Scope 3 standard. We revised the boundary requirements from 80% of anticipated emissions to all emissions, but I'll explain that in a second. We revised the data definitions, data quality, and streamlined reporting. We got a lot of similar feedback in general around data and boundaries for both standards. For those of you who were familiar with the Scope 3 categories before, just to give you an update on what's changed, the main thing we've done is we've added a lot of guidance on the categories that weren't already included in the standard, given some information on what a minimum boundary of the category might be, what a company could assume is in the category. But we also originally had Category 1 as direct supplier Tier 1 Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then Category 2 as cradle-to-gate purchased goods. And inevitably, there's an overlap there, and companies were very confused on why there were two categories that overlapped in data. So what we've decided to do is we've moved the supplier data, but as Andrea pointed out earlier, there's a lot of companies that really value the supplier engagement. So what we've done is we've moved that to a separate metric. It's no longer a category, but we do require companies to report on supplier engagement and how much supplier Scope 1 and 2 data they've collected. So the only category we have on purchased goods is upstream cradle-to-gate purchased goods and services, which could be from supplier data, but most likely would be from secondary databases at this point. We used to have an other category. This only included employee commuting because we couldn't figure out where it fit. But we found that to be confusing, so we decided to stretch it a little bit and say that, people pay for their employees, therefore it's somewhat of a purchase, so therefore it is considered an upstream category. And we added a category based on road tester feedback of processing of sold products. This is particularly for intermediate product producers who wish to include their downstream emissions. They can include the processing of their product before it becomes used in this category. The boundary requirements. So if you're familiar with the Scope 3 standard, the original requirement was that 80% of the anticipated Scope 3 emissions be included. During the road testing feedback workshop, we spent a lot of time discussing this, and in general, most companies were able to collect 80%, but that was only after estimating all 100% first, and it was actually more work for them to then go back and try to figure out what was 80% than just including all 100% or everything they could estimate. So even though that was an attempt to simplify things, we actually found that it made things more difficult. So we've moved away from that threshold, and companies shall account for and report all Scope 3 emissions, but they can disclose and justify any exclusions. And you'll see similarities between this statement and the statement in the product standard. Companies can disclose categories that either they don't have, maybe they don't do business travel, or things that they've estimated to be very small, or they just don't have the data for that category. They just need to be clear about that in their inventory report. To do these justifications, we recommend they adhere to the principles of the standard, and we provide some guidance on what shouldn't be excluded, basically anything that's significant to the company, significant to stakeholders, contribute to the company's risk, or perhaps maybe something that everyone else in your sector performs in-house and you outsource. It's just, this is something that companies will need to determine on their own what they think needs to be included. Data guidance. So there's no requirement to collect primary data in the Scope 3 standard. We encourage companies to engage with suppliers, but that's not, if they choose not to, they can exclude that category. We anticipate that Scope 3 inventories will be a mix of primary data and secondary data, and because of that, we did add additional guidance on data quality to Scope 3. Originally, the data quality guidance was only in the product standard, but we got a lot of feedback that was also helpful to people doing a Scope 3 inventory. So we've added that same guidance. And the Scope 3 standard is going to provide calculation guidance for each emissions category. This is, again, another request for proposals that was submitted over the summer, and we're working with Carbon Trust to develop guidance for each of the categories to really help companies figure out how to estimate those emissions and calculate those emissions. It's unclear now, as you can imagine, it's a lot of information. So it's unclear now whether it would be an appendix to the standard or a separate document on our website, but we are working to provide that for companies. The reporting requirements of Scope 3, a lot of these are the same as what they were before. I've highlighted the ones that are slightly updated. A list of activities included in the report and excluded with their justifications, as I just discussed about the boundary conditions. We are trying to work in, based on the feedback, that more options should be available for companies that want to report on data quality and uncertainty. For each category, a description of the methodologies, allocations, and data sources shall be included, and then optionally companies can report more information on uncertainty if they feel that's important to their stakeholders. And as I mentioned, the total supplier Scope 1 and 2 emissions data allocated to the reporting company for companies that do a supplier engagement program. So that's all the updates on the requirements. There's much more edits that were made. So I encourage you again to read the next standards. So moving into next steps, we are putting the final touches on the next updates of the standard. The last feedback we received was that hopefully they'd be done, they're on schedule to be released next Monday. So look for that. If you're already a stakeholder advisory group member, you should get an email telling you when those standards are available. If you're not, we encourage you to sign up to be a stakeholder advisor, be in the stakeholder advisory group, or just check our website sometime in the next week to see if the standards have been up. We're moving away from a Excel-based or Word-based written comments memo into a online-based comments memo, hopefully, to help us streamline the feedback of comments. So information on how to use that will be available on our website. Just the remaining milestones after we release the draft and go through another 30-day comment period, we'll again assess the comments and make any revisions necessary, working with the steering committee and technical working group members, road testers as needed. We hope to finalize the text of the standard this winter and then launch the final standards in spring. And I thought it'd be important to note that we're also translating the draft standard into Mandarin so that we can get Chinese stakeholder feedback on this next draft. So what are we doing in the meantime? We're still developing guidance and tools based on the feedback we received, and you heard some of it today. Particularly, we're going to include some additional guidance on supplier engagement. A lot of companies that have done supplier engagement programs have wisdom to share with the rest of the companies out there that are interested in doing that, so we're going to include that. Some data collection templates we're trying to work on. Like I mentioned, the uncertainty calculation guidance, program design guidance, and then hopefully a descriptive list of secondary data sources to help companies that need to get started. Sometimes it's overwhelming to where to start to look for data. What we hope to do moving forward, we're going to continue our ongoing effort to harmonize with the other standards being developed. We're a liaison member with the ISO process. We've been heavily involved, and we hope to continue to be involved with the past 2050 updates. And we really see this moving in the right direction on all fronts. We'd like to work with program operators and try to figure out how the community should move forward to develop sector and product-specific guidance. We hope to maybe host a workshop of program operators to try to further this discussion even more. So if you're interested in that, let us know. This would probably be sometime next year. We, of course, want to launch the standard, and so if you have conferences or meetings coming up this next spring that you think would be beneficial to hear about this, let us know and we can talk about presenting there. And then we're going to continue with training curriculums, particularly in developing countries, and providing tools and templates. So if you've used the standard and think of a tool that would be really helpful, that information would really benefit us as we try to prioritize which tools to develop. So that's all I have. I hope this was beneficial. I certainly learned a lot from the presentations, and I hope you did as well. We'll take some questions now, but if I'll be here the rest of the forum for any more questions, and you can always email Andrea or myself. So thank you.